I'm Tucker, and welcome to Last Moments. Today I'm covering deaths that started with the pettiest complaints imaginable, from a woman who called the cops over a neighbor's tree and ended up crushed by it, to a movie theater argument that turned fatal before the opening credits finished rolling. It was October 22nd, 2017, in Paramus, New Jersey. A major weekend sale packed a suburban shopping center with cars and pedestrians. Traffic stalled in narrow lanes, horns sounded, and shoppers moved between idling vehicles as congestion erased any margin for error. Lorraine Buckley was 51 and had shopped at the center for years. She planned her errands carefully and arrived that afternoon with a short list built around bundled discounts and limited quantity deals she didn't want to miss. She believed being early and prepared entitled her to move through the process without delays. When other shoppers disrupted that expectation, she tended to see it as unfair behavior rather than normal congestion. She preferred a specific parking area close to the main entrance, which she considered her usual spot due to how often she used it. That afternoon, she arrived expecting heavier traffic because of the sale, but did not anticipate how crowded the lot had become. As she crept through the lanes, frustration mounted. The delays conflicted with her plan to get inside quickly before popular items sold out. The parking lot was laid out with angled spaces, concrete wheel stops, and narrow drive lanes bordered by pedestrian walkways. A slight downhill grade ran through the central aisle, subtle, but enough to allow a vehicle to roll if it was not fully secured. Surveillance cameras mounted on tall light poles monitored entrances and several sections of the lot. After several minutes of waiting, Lorraine saw a vehicle back out of a space near the entrance, one she regularly used during past visits. Before she could reach it, another driver approached from the opposite direction and pulled in first. Lorraine slowed anyway, lingering in the lane as if the space had been hers to take. Traffic stacked behind Lorraine, blocking her path forward. Instead of continuing on, she stopped her car in the traffic lane and stepped out to confront the driver who had already parked, insisting the space had been hers to take. In her frustration, she left the engine running and did not fully place the transmission into park. The lane sloped slightly downhill. As Lorraine stood beside the open driver's door, the car began to roll backward. The movement was slow but steady. With the door open and a concrete parking barrier directly behind her, there was no space to step clear. Within seconds, the vehicle pinned her between the door frame and the barrier. Nearby, shoppers witnessed her chest being compressed against the barrier and rushed to help. Several pushed the vehicle forward while another person climbed into the driver's seat to stop it. Emergency services were called immediately from nearby storefronts. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Lorraine unresponsive, suffering from severe blunt force trauma and ineffective breathing. Resuscitation efforts were attempted but unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was traumatic compression of the chest and abdomen, resulting in collapsed lungs and extensive internal bleeding. Investigators found no mechanical defects in the vehicle. Surveillance footage confirmed the car had not been secured before she exited and showed no interference by other drivers. The death was ruled accidental and attributed to driver error. The shopping center later installed additional signage reminding drivers not to stop in traffic lanes and to secure vehicles before exiting. The opposing driver was cleared of responsibility, and the case was closed after administrative review. It was March 22nd, 2021, inside a mid-range casual restaurant during the early evening dinner rush in Columbus, Ohio. The kitchen was moving at full pace, tables were filled, orders were going in, and the staff were working through the service the way they always did on a busy Monday night. Lydia Harper was 47 years old and was a compliance auditor. She was dining alone. She had ordered a steak and been specific about it from the start, telling the server exactly how she wanted it cooked and making clear that precision mattered to her. Her colleagues said she once flagged a catering order at a work event for the same reason and made the staff reheat every dish before she would sit down. When the plate arrived, she cut into it, looked at the center, and put her knife down. She reached into her bag and pulled out a digital food thermometer she had brought with her. She inserted it into the steak and read the number. The reading came back lower than she expected. She relied on it as definitive. The steak had been cooked within the safe and standard temperature range. Lydia did not know that. She called the server back. Then again, her voice rose above the ambient noise of the dining room. She told the server the kitchen did not know what they were doing and that the food was unsafe. The server offered to have the steak remade and explained how internal temperatures were measured in the kitchen. Lydia dismissed the explanation rather than engaging with it. She said she had the number right in front of her. She asked for the manager and made clear she intended to report the restaurant. The server stepped away to get the manager. Lydia stood up from her table. She followed the server toward the back of the restaurant. When the server passed through the kitchen door, Lydia pushed through it behind her, moving past the point where customers were expected to stop. I have never worked in a professional kitchen, but I know enough to understand that walking into one during a dinner rush uninvited is not something you do. Lydia knew enough about compliance to carry a thermometer in her bag. Somehow that did not make the list. The kitchen was in full service. Staff were moving between stations. Plates were going out. A section of the floor near the prep area had been mopped during service to clear a spill. A warning sign was present, though it sat slightly off the path she had taken coming through the door. Near the prep line, a low-profile grease trap cover sat flush with the floor, with a rigid metal edge slightly raised above the surrounding surface. The lip was rigid and fixed with no give on contact. Lydia, still focused on catching the server, was not watching where she was going. Her foot hit the mopped surface. The wet floor offered no traction under her forward step. Her foot lost traction on the wet surface, and her forward momentum carried her past the point where she could recover. The back of her head struck first against the raised metal edge of the grease trap cover. She did not respond or move after the impact. Kitchen staff responded immediately. Emergency services were called. The dinner service stopped. Paramedics arrived and assessed her on site. Lydia Harper was pronounced dead at the scene. And here is one part that really stands out to me. A review of the incident determined that the steak had been cooked within the accepted safe temperature range and that her thermometer reading had been inaccurate due to shallow insertion and improper calibration. She had entered a restricted work area without authorization. The steak was fine. The kitchen was doing its job. I keep thinking about how differently that evening goes if she had just considered for one moment that the thermometer might be wrong. It was July 9th, 2017, at an airboat tour park on the western edge of the Florida Everglades, where the water sits black and still in the afternoon heat, and the tree line dissolves into a shimmer of cypress and sawgrass. That morning had been unremarkable. By early afternoon, it wasn't. Tanya Belrose was 38 years old and worked as a sales coordinator for a luxury retail brand in Naples, Florida. People who knew her described her as sharp, funny in small doses, and constitutionally unable to accept being told what to do by anyone she considered beneath her. She had been escorted out of 2 separate animal parks in the previous 18 months for pushing past handlers during restricted demonstrations. That day, she had brought a cooler bag containing raw chicken on this particular tour. She had planned the video in advance. What I find hardest to process here is that she saw every warning sign, heard every instruction, and interpreted all of it as an obstacle rather than information. That is not recklessness in the traditional sense. It is something more deliberate, and in some ways more troubling. The afternoon tour group boarded the airboat around 2 p.m. The guide covered the wildlife viewing protocol before the vessel moved. No crossing the rope barrier near the bank. No food items near the water's edge. No leaning over the side in the marked areas. A large male alligator, estimated at 11 feet, was a frequent sighting in that stretch of shoreline. The guide was specific. He was not vague or casual about it. Tanya rolled her eyes through the entire briefing and told the tourist beside her that staff at places like this exaggerated the danger to seem important. She kept the cooler bag between her feet. The boat idled near the dock at the observation stop. The water was dark, the surface unbroken, the bank muddy and sloped where the grass gave way to open water. The area was bordered by a railed dock with a restricted access gate at the entry point, and guests were instructed to remain behind it. Tanya waited until the guide turned to point out a bird rookery in the distance, then stepped past the barrier, positioned herself near the bank's edge, raised her phone vertically with one hand, and lowered a piece of raw chicken toward the water with the other. The guide turned back and shouted at her to return behind the barrier, but she shouted at him back. He had taken 2 steps toward her when the water opened. There was no visible approach. The alligator came up fast and vertical. its jaws closing over her lower forearm near the wrist. The sound witnesses described was not what most expected, less of a splash than a concussive displacement of water, followed immediately by her scream. She pulled backward rather than releasing the chicken or collapsing her weight downward. The alligator rolled. It is a specific mechanical movement, a full rotation on the body's axis designed to disorient and destabilize prey. She lost her footing on the sloped mud and went down hard, her lower body entering the water as the animal pulled deeper. Two staff members threw rescue poles toward the bank and shouted for the group to move back. I think about the staff in this story more than I think about most things in these videos I make. They followed every protocol correctly and still had to watch this happen. The tour guide radioed park staff immediately. A second employee called emergency services at the same moment. EMS arrived in approximately 14 minutes, delayed by the access road conditions. She was declared dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be exsanguination and drowning secondary to traumatic degloving and crush fractures of the right forearm, with evidence of immersion during active struggle. Authorities were dispatched later that day and removed and euthanized the alligator. An animal conditioned by human feeding behavior cannot be safely relocated. That is standard and correct protocol, and it is also the part of this story I find genuinely infuriating. The alligator did exactly what an alligator does. It paid for her decision with its life. Tanya's family issued public statements blaming the park for the better part of a week before witness accounts and other tourists' phone recordings, along with partial recovered device footage, made further argument untenable. The tour operation remained open. The rope barrier was reinforced with a second physical rail and a restricted access system. It was January 21st, 2018, Gold Coast, Queensland, Australia. An amusement park on a busy summer morning. The roller coaster used a standard chain lift system with lap bar restraints. It was one of the most popular rides in the park and had run without serious incident for years. Vanessa Clark was 36. She worked as an event planner and cared deeply about how she appeared to others. Her social media was carefully maintained and she treated every outing as a chance to capture herself in the right light. She had recently finalized a divorce and chose to spend the day at the park alone to mark the occasion. She arrived expecting everything to go exactly as she had planned. Her behavior towards staff started at the first ride. The queue was long, and she asked to be moved to the front. She said she had paid for a full-day ticket and did not see why she should be treated the same as everyone else in line. When the staff declined, she asked for a supervisor. The supervisor gave the same answer. She criticized the system, saying other parks handled it better, then walked away, still talking. At the roller coaster, signs at the entrance clearly prohibited selfie sticks and loose items. The ride operator repeated the rules out loud before boarding. Hands inside, stay properly seated, keep the lap bar down at all times. When asked to store her bag, Vanessa brushed it off. Confident she already knew how rides like this worked, she stored the bag but kept a small, collapsible selfie stick concealed along her side, out of the operator's direct view as she took her seat. When the operator moved along the car to check restraints, he performed a quick visual pass, confirming each bar appeared locked without applying additional pressure. Vanessa pulled the lap bar down once until it clicked and gave a brief nod before he reached her fully. The bar sat lower than ideal, leaving space between it and her thighs, but it appeared secured at a glance. A tighter position would have restricted her movement, so she left it as it was, and the operator continued down the row. She treated the instructions as unnecessary and focused on getting the photo. As the coaster climbed the chain lift hill, she pulled out the selfie stick and extended it. She leaned forward over her knees and lifted her hips off the seat to frame the shot. As her hips rose, her thighs slid backward and down along the seat, creating clearance beneath the lap bar until it was no longer making contact with her legs. The bar stayed in position. Her body had moved away from it. She was no longer secured by the restraint. She braced against the footrest and pushed forward, shifting her center of mass toward the front of the car as the train approached the crest. As the train crested, her weight reduced against the seat, removing the last resistance keeping her in position. The nose of the car tipped down sharply into the descent. The forward rotation her own push had already started combined with the pitch of the drop. The lap bar was at her midsection, and her legs were no longer behind it. As the train tipped over the crest and began its descent, she was carried forward over the bar and out of the car. The coaster finished its run and stopped at the end of the circuit. Passengers got off and told staff what they had seen during the ride. Park staff responded immediately, and emergency services were called. Vanessa Clark was found on the ground below the track at the point where the descent began. She was alive, but unresponsive. Paramedics stabilized her at the scene, and she was transported to hospital where she underwent emergency surgery. She did not regain consciousness. Vanessa Clark was pronounced dead 18 hours later from traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding consistent with the fall. Investigators determined that Vanessa had deliberately left the bar with slack and had not followed repeated safety instructions given before departure. The park introduced mandatory lap bar checks before departure and tightened its loose item policy across all major attractions. It was April 14th, 2016. The cliffs of Moher had absorbed Atlantic wind for thousands of years, and on that Tuesday morning the gusts came in sustained, directional bursts that bent the gorse flat and sent paper cups skittering across the visitor center plaza. Loren Nunez, 29, had grown up in Albuquerque and started professionally as a freelance outdoor photographer before becoming a travel influencer. She framed herself as an explorer, pushing back against the sanitizing of wild places, and her audience rewarded it consistently. She had listed the cliffs of Moher as a target for over a year, specifically the sections beyond the barriers where the unobstructed cliff face could be captured without crowds. She traveled with professional camera equipment, planned arrival times around light conditions, and had researched the site's staffing patterns in advance. She had budgeted 2 full days on site. The upper shelf edges are composed of flagstone and shale, porous formations that accumulate biofilm under overcast, damp conditions, developing a thin algae layer that eliminates surface friction without appearing wet to the eye. On the morning of April 14th, the rock beyond the barriers had been wet since before dawn. Lauren left the designated path within 20 minutes of arriving. A staff member intercepted her and explained the zone beyond the barrier was closed due to wind. According to staff reports and multiple bystander accounts, she told him the barrier was designed for people who didn't know what they were doing, demanded to know under what legal authority she was being stopped, and told him the park was treating paying visitors like children. She said she had been to more dangerous places and nothing had happened. 2 additional staff members approached over the next 20 minutes and received the same. She filmed all 3 interactions. Tourists nearby had begun recording as well. She stepped over the waist-high barrier while still filming. She positioned herself on a natural rock shelf roughly 4 feet wide, approximately 15 feet past the barrier, sloped toward the ocean. She adjusted her footing once, then held her phone out to frame the shot. The site's weather station logged a 52-mile-per-hour crosswind gust along the cliff face at that moment. Her left shoe lost contact with the rock first. The slope angled her weight toward the edge as she tried to step right to correct. The correction failed. Her arms came up and out. She went backward, not over the face, but out, away from the cliff entirely, into open air. The fall covered approximately 600 feet. Witnesses on the path saw her body strike a rock outcrop roughly 200 feet below the cliff top. The impact produced a sudden, visible change in the body's direction and rotation before the fall continued. Several people who had been filming stopped at that point. The sound reached the footpath a fraction of a second after the visual. Wave action covered the surface within moments. Park staff contacted emergency services immediately. A Coast Guard unit arrived within 15 minutes, but sea conditions along the base of the cliffs delayed recovery for several hours. Her body was located and brought ashore that afternoon. Coroner findings noted massive blunt force trauma, consistent with high-velocity impact against rock, including catastrophic skeletal fractures and extensive organ rupture throughout the torso and cranial structure. Water entry occurred post-mortem. Cause of death was recorded as multiple traumatic injuries from a fall from height. Footage recorded by bystanders circulated on multiple platforms before removal. Among the clips preserved briefly was the one Loren filmed of herself crossing the barrier. It had uploaded automatically before the fall. The park expanded physical signage and reinforced barrier sections at several high-exposure overlooks in the months following. A local government discussion about criminal penalties for barrier violations was raised, but did not advance to legislation. Her account went private under family management not long after.
It was April 14th, 2016. The afternoon sun hung over a neighborhood dog park in South Austin, Texas, casting long shadows across the fenced enclosure where families gathered with their pets. Margaret Lee, 58, had no children of her own. Her family said that after her divorce 8 years earlier, she had channeled all her maternal instincts into Prince, whom she had raised from a puppy. Co-workers described her as defensive and confrontational, particularly when anyone questioned her dog handling practices. She had been cited twice by animal control for off-leash violations, but dismissed the warnings as overreach by bureaucrats who did not understand proper animal behavior. Friends said that Margaret frequently posted on social media groups for pit bull owners, defending the breed against what she called unfair stereotypes, while simultaneously documenting Prince's aggressive responses to perceived threats. That afternoon, the park was busier than usual. Several families with young children occupied the grassy area adjacent to the dog enclosure. A father in his early 30s had brought his 3-year-old daughter to watch the dogs from a safe distance. Margaret unleashed Prince immediately upon entering, ignoring the posted signs and verbal warnings from nearby dog owners. When approached by the father, who politely asked her to restrain her dog near the children, Margaret responded that Prince was perfectly trained and posed no danger to anyone. Prince initially appeared calm, sniffing the ground and exploring the perimeter. His body was rigid, a low rumble vibrating in his throat, and he moved forward without the typical sniff and turn most dogs show. Within minutes, the dog approached the toddler, who had wandered closer to the fence line. The father moved to block Prince's approach, and when the dog lunged at the child with bared teeth, showing stiff posture, forward ears, and raised hackles, the father instinctively kicked at the animal to protect his daughter. The kick struck Prince in the shoulder, causing the dog to yelp and temporarily retreat rather than escalating. Margaret witnessed this from across the park and ran toward the father, screaming that he had assaulted her dog. Witnesses reported that she shoved the man with both hands, nearly knocking him over. Before anyone could intervene, Margaret pulled a canister of pepper spray from her jacket pocket and aimed it at the father's face. A sudden shifting gust funneled the spray back into her face at point-blank range. The concentrated capsaicin caused immediate blindness and respiratory distress. She dropped the canister and clawed frantically at her burning eyes, her vision completely obscured. The spray left her disoriented, coughing, and functionally blind. Disoriented and panicking, she stumbled backward through the park gate, which someone had left open during the commotion. Margaret staggered blindly toward the street, her hands still covering her face. Multiple witnesses shouted warnings, but she could not orient herself. She reached the curb and stepped directly into the path of a city bus, traveling approximately 40 miles per hour on the adjacent road. The arterial road offered no crosswalk near the gate, and shrubs along the sidewalk partially obscured the driver's view. The driver had no time to brake. The impact threw Margaret's body nearly 25 feet. A bystander called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but Margaret had died on impact. The medical examiner's report documented multiple blunt force trauma injuries, including severe skull fractures and catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. The ME noted trace amounts of capsaicin in the ocular tissue consistent with recent exposure. Prince was impounded by animal control for a standard 10-day rabies observation, while the city initiated a dangerous dog review. Margaret's estate became the subject of potential civil claims following the incident, and the father later pursued charges related to the assault and pepper spray escalation.
It was July 4th, 2017, at Lake Lanier, Georgia. A crowded holiday gathering filled a narrow wooden dock with music, coolers, and constant movement between boats, while submerged hazards below the surface went largely unnoticed. Pamela Rhodes was 49 years old and worked in an office support role that required organization, follow-through, and enforcing procedures. Friends described her as assertive and opinionated, especially in group settings where she felt order was being ignored. She often inserted herself into situations without being asked, convinced that problems escalated only because others failed to act quickly enough. Pamela attended the gathering with friends and acquaintances to celebrate the holiday. Alcohol was present throughout the afternoon, and guests moved freely between boats and the dock. The structure was older, built for light foot traffic rather than sustained crowds. Wooden planks showed visible wear, with gaps widening near the edges. Beneath the surface, submerged support beams sat just below varying water depths due to fluctuating lake levels that summer. As the afternoon progressed, congestion increased along the dock. A large cooler filled with ice and drinks had been placed near the edge earlier in the day to serve people stepping off boats. Several guests had already mentioned that it should be moved back toward the center once traffic increased. One man began preparing to relocate it, but was waiting for help to lift it safely, as it was heavy and partially wedged against the planks. Pamela noticed the cooler and became visibly irritated. Witnesses later stated she complained that it was blocking movement and creating a hazard, insisting it should not be there at all. When told it would be moved shortly, she dismissed the explanation and continued gesturing, positioning herself closer to the edge of the dock as she argued. Rather than waiting, Pamela stepped toward the cooler and kicked it sharply, attempting to force it away from the edge. The sudden movement shifted her weight backward. At the same moment, her heel slipped into a widened gap between two planks. With no railing to stop her, she lost balance and fell backward over the side of the dock. Pamela went headfirst into the water, striking a submerged wooden support beam with significant force. The impact fractured her cervical spine. She lost consciousness immediately and sank briefly before resurfacing near the dock. Several guests witnessed the fall and shouted for help. 2 people entered the water, while others tried to locate her position from above. Rescue efforts were delayed by limited visibility and submerged beams obstructing movement. Pamela was pulled from the water several minutes later and laid flat on the dock. Emergency services were called immediately. First responders arrived by boat and shoreline access within approximately 10 minutes. Pamela showed no signs of consciousness and was not breathing effectively. Resuscitation efforts began on scene but were unsuccessful. The medical examiner determined death resulted from blunt force trauma to the neck combined with drowning. The spinal fracture prevented voluntary movement or effective breathing. Toxicology testing showed alcohol present, but not at incapacitating levels. Investigators documented overcrowding beyond the dock's intended capacity and cited the owner for failing to post occupancy warnings. The death was ruled accidental. The gathering ended immediately, and the dock was later modified to restrict future events. It was September 3rd, 2017, on a quiet residential street in Decatur, Georgia. The morning was calm. The houses sat close together the way they do in older developments, with trees along the property lines that had been growing for decades before anyone thought to argue about them. Mary Ann Keller was 52 years old and worked as a paralegal. She owned the house on the left side of one of those boundaries. For more than 3 years, she had been keeping a record on the oak tree that sat just over her neighbor's side of the line. She had photographs of the roots. She had notes about the limbs that extended over her yard. She had filed complaints and followed up on them. In her view, the tree was a threat, and nobody was moving fast enough to deal with it. 3 years of documentation, photographs, filed complaints, follow-up calls. I will give her this much. She was organized, but what baffles me is the chain of events that played out next. Things came to a head when she went to confront her neighbor directly. She demanded the tree be cut down, telling her neighbor it was damaging her property and that she had been patient long enough. When the conversation stalled, she did not leave. She repeated the demand, raised her voice, and stepped closer as her neighbor attempted to disengage. The exchange turned physical. Her neighbor slapped her. Mary Ann went home and decided she was done waiting for anyone else to act. She hired an arborist on her own. She did not coordinate with her neighbor. The scope of the work was specific. Remove only the limbs extending over her property line, presenting the job as work confined strictly within her side of the boundary, to reduce what she saw as the structural risk. The arborist was operating as a small, independent contractor, and the job was treated as a limited trim rather than a full structural assessment. He agreed to proceed on those terms, with no full assessment and no formal plan for where cut material would fall. She hired someone to cut a tree she did not own, without a structural assessment, without a fall zone plan. I kept trying to understand what was actually going on in her mind. The tree itself was mature. It had a slight lean toward Mary Ann's property. The soil around its base was compacted, the kind of ground that does not hold roots as firmly as it looks like it should. Some of the roots along the property line had already been disturbed over the years. The tree had stayed upright because the weight on both sides of the canopy balanced each other out. The arborist had told her to keep clear of the base while he worked, but she remained within a few feet of the trunk, inside the radius of the canopy, focused on the cuts being made above her. Her attention stayed on the canopy rather than the base of the tree. The arborist began cutting from one side. The first limbs came down without any visible problem. Then he removed a section that had been counterweighting the heavier side of the canopy, reducing the torque on the trunk. As the final fibers of the cut section gave way, the limb dropped free. Then the load shifted abruptly through the trunk toward the lean. The arborist paused to reposition his equipment. The stress moved down into the root plate. There was a low cracking sound at the base. The soil near the roots shifted slightly. The shift was gradual for a few seconds. A lift at the root plate, a widening gap in the soil, and then the movement accelerated. Once the trunk committed to the lean, the fall completed in seconds. Marianne was still looking at the canopy when the trunk came down across her. The weight of it compressed her chest and torso against the ground. She did not move after the impact. Emergency services were called. Neighbors appeared at the doors. Marianne Keller was pronounced dead following emergency assessment at the scene. A review of the incident found that the removal of a key counterbalancing limb had altered the tree's structural stability. The root system had been vulnerable before the work began. No full stability assessment had been carried out before cutting started. No fall zone had been established. Marianne had been standing within the impact zone during active cutting. The incident was classified as a fatal tree failure resulting from structural imbalance introduced during partial limb removal, conducted without full stability assessment or safe positioning of persons on site. You know what really gets me about this? The neighbor she had been fighting with for 3 years was inside her house when it happened. It was February 3rd, 2018, in a suburban backyard on the southern fringe of Brisbane, Australia, on a morning that started warm and ordinary, the kind of late summer Sunday that should have ended with sunscreen on forearms and a barbecue going by early afternoon. It didn't. Crystal Vane was 41, a school fundraising volunteer known well enough in her neighborhood to be either the first person you'd call for a bake sale or the last one you'd want at a block meeting. She ran a small local outrage page online built around complaints, public call-outs, and videos of businesses, neighbors, or council workers she felt were failing basic responsibilities. She seemed to have learned that outrage traveled faster than jokes, and being difficult got more views than being funny. The local council knew her by name and dreaded her calls. Previous complaints had ended with shouting matches in offices, one parking lot shoving incident, and a warning from staff to keep interactions documented. A neighbor had flagged the ground nest near the garden shed 2 weeks earlier, described it as aggressive, warned her to keep Liam away. Crystal had reported it to local council services twice and complained that nothing had been done. After what she described to friends as another dismissive call from the useless idiots at council, she decided she would film the problem herself and post it publicly, hoping to go viral and force the authorities to respond. The plan, as she laid it out that morning, was to spray the nest opening on camera and show just how dangerous it was. She positioned him roughly 30 feet back near the back fence, far enough that she believed he'd stay clear of whatever happened, close enough to capture it. She told him to keep recording no matter what. He was 12. The backyard was green and overgrown near the shed line. Jasmine climbing a rusted trellis, a plastic kiddie pool half deflated against the concrete path, the grass gone patchy where summer had cooked it. Nothing about the scene read as dangerous from 30 feet away. The nest entrance was a thumb-width hole at the base of the shed's concrete footer, easy to miss unless you knew to look. The colony beneath it, investigators later estimated, was likely in the range of several hundred to a few thousand wasps, rather than a single fixed number. She approached to within arm's length and directed the spray nozzle downward at the opening. The canister discharged for approximately 2 seconds before the first wasps broke the surface. Liam's footage, reviewed by police and later described in witness statements, showed what followed in real time. The initial swarm hit her face and neck within the first second. She recoiled backward and inhaled a sharp, audible pull of breath, and the screaming that followed lasted only a few seconds before it changed character entirely, becoming something lower and more labored. She began clawing at her throat with both hands. Liam, from 30 feet away, was already calling her name. She stumbled back along the concrete path, her balance gone, the swarm dense enough around her head that her face was only intermittently visible through the moving cluster of wasps rather than fully obscured at all times. Her left heel caught the soft folded rim of the deflated kiddie pool, and she went down sideways, her right temple and shoulder striking the concrete path at the edge of the pool. The impact was audible on the recording. The wasps did not disperse. A neighbor in the adjacent yard heard the screaming change pitch and came over the fence within roughly 2 minutes. He described finding Liam frozen near the back fence, still holding the phone up. He pulled Liam out through the side gate first, then called emergency services. By his own account, 4 minutes passed between when he first heard the screaming and when he made the call. Time spent getting Liam out, understanding what he was seeing, and reaching his own phone. Paramedic crews arrived approximately 9 minutes after the call. Crystal was transported to a regional hospital and died later that afternoon. The coroner's finding, in plain terms, was that she suffered anaphylactic shock triggered by multiple wasp stings, complicated by airway swelling that restricted breathing, alongside blunt head trauma from the fall. Either condition alone may have been survivable with faster intervention. Together they were not. Police classified it as an accidental domestic death. Her online page was gone within a week, removed by the platform or by someone with access to the account. The record isn't clear. The neighbor who pulled Liam out later arranged and paid for professional nest removal across several properties on the block, after pest control found additional colonies in nearby yards. What's crazy here is Liam's presence, 12 years old, told to keep recording no matter what, standing there watching it happen. I hope someone made sure he had real support afterward, because that's not something you just move on from. It was July 22, 2018, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. A public zoo on a warm summer afternoon. Families moved along the paths in both directions. The black bear enclosure sat along one of the main routes, fenced, signed, and built to keep a fixed distance between visitors and the animal inside. Cheryl Mason was 47. She worked as an office administrator and had spent the better part of the previous months buried in work that had ground her down. This trip was the first real break she had taken in a while. She trusted her own judgment and liked to feel in control of things. She had read before coming that American black bears were shy and non-confrontational, and had taken that to mean they were safe at close range if you stayed calm. A friend had told her that zoo animals were kept hungrier than they needed to be, and that the feeding rules were more about liability than actual risk. That stuck with her. When she reached the black bear enclosure, the animal was moving along the fence line in a loose pattern. She watched it for a moment and decided it was hungry. The way it was moving, coming toward the fence, it looked to her like something was looking for food. She opened her bag, took out a granola bar, and broke off a piece. The signs on the fence were right there. No feeding, no reaching through the barrier. She had seen them and kept walking toward the fence anyway. There was a corner seam where 2 fence panels met at a slight angle. The gap at that point was a little wider than the rest of the enclosure. Not broken, not a safety failure, just slightly wider than the panels on either side. Wide enough. She positioned herself there, leaned forward, and pushed her hand through the gap with the piece of granola bar held out toward the bear. The bear had already been drifting toward that section of the fence as she approached, tracking the food in her hand. 2 staff members saw it happen at the same time from different spots along the path. Both started moving toward her immediately. One of them called out for her to stop. Cheryl turned toward the voice with clear irritation on her face. She told him to relax, that it was just a small piece, and that the bear was clearly hungry. The staff member repeated the instruction, louder this time. Cheryl did not move her arm. She said she was not hurting anything and that they did not need to make a scene. She stayed leaned forward with her hand still through the gap while she was saying it, as though the conversation and the feeding were 2 separate things she could handle at the same time. She was still holding the granola out when the bear reached through. The grip on her hand and lower arm was immediate. The force behind it was not something she could pull against from where she was standing, already leaned forward with her weight toward the fence and nothing to brace from. The bear tore through the soft tissue of her hand and forearm before it released, and staff reached her. They got to her within seconds and pressed down on the arm and tried to keep her stable while someone called emergency services. There was a lot of blood. Other visitors nearby had stopped and were not moving. Cheryl was taken to hospital. The injuries to her hand and forearm were severe. The damage to the blood vessels and surrounding tissue was too extensive. She did not make it. Cheryl Mason died in hospital from the injuries she sustained at the enclosure fence. She was 47 years old. The investigation afterward confirmed the feeding signs had been clearly posted and visible. Cheryl had gone to the wider gap at the corner seam and pushed her hand through in direct violation of the posted rules. Staff had called out a warning, and she had responded without pulling her arm back, staying in position at the gap long enough for the bear to make contact. No fault was found with the animal or the enclosure design. The zoo modified the corner seam spacing across its enclosures after the incident, so that the wider gap at panel joins no longer existed. It was September 3, 2017. By late afternoon, a roadside gas station in Shenzhen, China had become the site of a medical emergency that began over a returned bag of crackers. Lena Odenkirk was 32. Originally from suburban Ohio, was an American lifestyle influencer living in Shenzhen on a work visa she had long since repurposed. She had spent 6 years in retail before leaving, cashier and floor supervisor positions that left her deeply familiar with store policy. That background became the premise of an online content channel where she filmed disputes with business staff, narrated confrontations directly to her camera, and positioned herself as a consumer advocate. That afternoon, Lena stopped to refuel and picked up a bag of imported crackers from the station's interior convenience counter. She either threw away or consumed most of the contents before returning to the register and requesting a refund, citing the product as stale. The cashier declined, pointing to a no-return policy on opened food items posted behind the counter. That was the start of it. Within 2 minutes of the refusal, Lena was already filming. She narrated the interaction to her phone's camera, raised her voice, and knocked items from a nearby rack. Staff called a supervisor. She moved outside, planted herself in front of a vehicle at the pump lane, and blocked it until drivers honked. She returned inside moments later. The supervisor had not yet arrived. 2 customers and a delivery driver were present in the shop. The cashier had not moved from behind the counter. Lena approached the display case and struck its side panel with the base of her palm. Once, then again. Witnesses said she hit the same location 3 to 4 more times without pausing. On the 4th or 5th blow, the glass fractured along the lower edge seam. The panel did not shatter outward. It collapsed inward in large, uneven pieces, suggesting it was not a standard tempered panel. Her right arm followed through the motion before she could stop it. A jagged edge of broken glass sliced across the underside of her right forearm at the wrist. The cut penetrated deeply, severing the radial artery and likely damaging adjacent vascular structures, tearing through surrounding soft tissue down to the bone. She recoiled through the frame, jerking backward as the edge cut further. Blood followed immediately, gushing from the wound and smearing darkly across the broken glass, dripping onto her clothes and the concrete beneath her. She fell down to the ground near the entrance, sliding slightly as arterial blood pulsed violently with each heartbeat, spreading rapidly across the floor. The cashier screamed sharply, while a nearby customer ran to his car and returned with a towel, pressing it firmly against the wound in an attempt to staunch the flow. Instead of accepting assistance, Lena resisted, repeatedly pulling her arm away and preventing sustained pressure from being applied, continuing her tirade in high-pitched, incoherent shouting. The bleeding did not slow within several minutes of the injury. Her movements slowed, her shouts lost coherence, and she stopped responding entirely, slumping further to the ground. Paramedics arrived approximately 11 minutes later, following a call from one of the motorists. Resuscitation efforts were initiated immediately on scene, including chest compressions and attempts to control the hemorrhage, but the extent of the trauma made revival impossible. After several minutes, resuscitation was discontinued. Lena Odenkirk was pronounced dead. Cause of death was acute hemorrhagic shock resulting from traumatic laceration of the radial artery and adjacent structures of the right wrist. Lena's online accounts went inactive within days of the incident. Several weeks later, a family member posted a short public message asking that her account will shortly be deleted. No criminal charges were filed against station staff. The case was officially closed as an accidental death.
It was May 19th, 2018. The Overtoom bike lane in Amsterdam stretched wide and busy under overcast skies, a main artery where thousands of cyclists commuted daily through one of Europe's most bike-dependent cities. Brigitte van der Berg, a 52-year-old administrative assistant at a local municipal office, walked in the center of the lane with her terrier on a long, retractable leash, trailing across the pavement, blocking traffic during the evening rush. Brigitte had worked in Amsterdam for 3 decades, but had never adapted to the city's cycling culture. Colleagues described her as stubborn and confrontational, someone who took minor inconveniences personally. She owned no bicycle herself, preferring to walk her dog Max through whatever route seemed convenient, regardless of designated bike infrastructure. Friends had warned her repeatedly about wandering into bike lanes, but she always disregarded their concerns. Amsterdam's bike lanes operate like highways, with cyclists traveling at speeds between 15 and 25 miles per hour in dedicated infrastructure, separated from pedestrian walkways by clear markings and physical barriers. The Overtoom lane was particularly fast-moving, serving as a commuter route where cargo bikes hauling children and goods mixed with racing cyclists and electric bikes. Pedestrians entering these lanes face serious injury risk, a fact reinforced by city safety campaigns Brigitte had seen but ignored. That evening, Brigitte walked Max directly into the bike lane despite pedestrian crossings located every 50 yards. Multiple cyclists rang their bells frantically as she meandered along, looking at her phone while her dog sniffed the pavement. Traffic backed up behind her, a dozen riders forced to slow from 20 miles per hour to a crawl. A delivery cyclist shouted at her to move. Brigitte stopped completely, turning to yell back that she had every right to be there. The delivery rider swerved around her, clipping another cyclist and crashing onto the pavement. His groceries scattered across the lane. Instead of stepping aside, Brigitte began shouting louder about reckless cyclists, completely oblivious to the cargo bike approaching from behind at a distance too short for the rider to safely stop, approximately 25 feet away. The cargo bike's operator, transporting two children in the front box, rang his bell repeatedly while braking hard. Brigitte remained planted in place, gesturing angrily at the crashed delivery cyclist. The cargo bike, weighing approximately 200 pounds loaded with its riders and cargo, struck Brigitte from behind at approximately 20 miles per hour, the impact lifting her off her feet. Her body flew forward feet before her head struck the top of a waist-high Amsterdammertje, a narrow, unpadded steel bollard lining the lane's edge. The hollow metallic clang echoed through the street as Brigitte crumpled to the ground. The leash released from her hand as it slipped free under tension while bystanders screamed. The cargo bike operator fell sideways, protecting his children, who were shaken but uninjured. A pedestrian called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, finding Brigitte unconscious with visible head trauma and labored breathing. She died en route to the hospital, despite resuscitation attempts. The autopsy revealed massive cranial fractures, thoracic trauma, 6 broken ribs, and severe internal hemorrhaging. The medical examiner confirmed the steel bollard impact as the primary cause of death, with blunt force trauma from the initial bike collision contributing. Amsterdam authorities used the incident to reinforce pedestrian safety regulations in bike lanes, installing additional warning signs along the Overtoom route. Investigators noted that nearby municipal CCTV and a cyclist helmet camera had captured the sequence of events, helping reconstruct the collision. Brigitte's terrier Max was rescued at the scene after being quickly retrieved by a bystander during the chaos, and later adopted by her neighbor, who had repeatedly warned her about the bike lanes she refused to respect.
It was August 18, 2015 in Bakersfield, California. Late summer heat hung over an industrial rail corridor where freight trains passed daily, often unnoticed by nearby residents. The area appeared familiar and routine to those who lived nearby, yet it carried constant risk that rarely announced itself until it was too late. Elaine Porter was 56 years old and worked in a supervisory clerical role for a mid-sized local operation. Her job required managing schedules, enforcing procedures, and meeting deadlines with limited tolerance for delay. Co-workers described her as efficient and blunt, with little patience for delays or disagreement, viewing obstacles as inefficiencies rather than warnings. She believed rules were optional when they interfered with efficiency, especially when she considered herself capable of managing the risk. Elaine lived within walking distance of an active rail line that cut between residential streets and commercial areas. Over time, residents formed an unofficial dirt footpath across the tracks, cutting less than 5 minutes off the walk while bypassing a marked pedestrian crossing 2 blocks away. Despite posted warning signs and fencing gaps, the path remained in use. Elaine used it regularly and had previously argued with neighbors who warned her about train traffic, insisting the concern was exaggerated and the shortcut harmless. On that afternoon, Elaine was returning from an errand and chose the shortcut as she had many times before. Freight traffic was heavier than usual due to seasonal shipping demands, and trains were operating at standard speeds. Warning signs prohibiting pedestrian crossing were visible on both sides of the corridor, but no crossing gates or signals were present at that location. As Elaine approached the tracks, a nearby pedestrian raised both arms and shouted, stepping toward the rails to warn her of an approaching train. She waved the warning off without slowing, and stepped onto the ballast gravel between the rails. The rail line curved slightly, limiting sight distance in one direction. The sound of the approaching train blended with surrounding industrial noise. The freight train emerged from the curve, traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour. The engineer applied emergency braking immediately upon seeing Elaine, but the required stopping distance far exceeded the remaining track. Elaine attempted to rush the remaining distance, but her footing failed on loose ballast gravel never designed for speed or balance. She fell forward onto the track bed as the locomotive closed the remaining distance in seconds. The front of the train struck her with overwhelming force, causing catastrophic blunt force trauma. The train continued past the point of impact before coming to a complete stop. Nearby workers and pedestrians witnessed the collision and contacted emergency services immediately. The engineer radioed the incident as soon as the train stopped. First responders arrived within minutes but found Elaine unresponsive, with injuries incompatible with survival. Her body showed extensive trauma consistent with a high-speed train impact. There were no signs of defensive movement or prolonged suffering. The scene was secured, and rail traffic was halted during the investigation. The coroner ruled the death the result of massive blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed train impact. Toxicology showed no intoxicants. Investigators reviewed onboard footage and braking data, confirming the engineer followed protocol and no mechanical failures occurred. The death was classified as accidental trespassing. Rail authorities reinforced fencing, removed the footpath, upgraded warning signs, and the case was closed after administrative review. It was November 29, 2019, at the entrance of a large electronics store in Memphis, Tennessee, in the early hours of Black Friday. The doors were scheduled to open at 5 a.m. Customers had been outside since the night before, standing in a line that grew longer and tighter as the morning crept forward. The crowd was packed tightly, with little space between individuals. The store had advertised limited quantities on high-demand items. Tasha Reynolds was 38 years old and arrived shortly before 4 a.m. She did not join the back of the line. She moved toward the front, stepping past people who had been there for hours. Pushing when stepping was not enough. The people around her noticed. Some said nothing, others spoke up. By the time she was near the front, several confrontations had already started, voices rising over each other in the cold morning air. She raised her voice over all of it, insisting she was not going to stand at the back behind people who did not even know what they were there for. The store doors were still closed. Staff were inside preparing. There was no one outside managing the crowd. I genuinely cannot imagine looking at a line of people who have been standing in the cold since midnight and deciding that your 4 a.m. arrival puts you at the front. That is the entire setup for everything that follows. Tasha kept moving forward. The arguments around her sharpened. People who had given up sleep to be there were not willing to simply step aside. The pushing and the words continued until Tasha reached into her bag and pulled out a small canister of pepper spray. She pointed it forward and released it. The spray hit the people directly in front of her. It then dispersed unevenly through the tightly packed crowd, affecting people beyond those directly in front of her. Some recoiled immediately, turning their faces away and raising their arms. Others pushed blindly in different directions, trying to escape the irritation in their eyes and throat. The movement was no longer linear. It broke into conflicting directions within the same space. In a crowd that close, with almost no room between bodies and nowhere for air to move, there was no clean direction to escape. The structure of the line collapsed in that section as individuals stumbled into each other. I still cannot get over the fact that she packed pepper spray for a shopping queue and then actually used it. An off-duty police officer was standing in the line nearby. He identified himself as law enforcement and gave repeated verbal commands, waiting a moment for compliance. When she did not comply, he moved to restrain her and attempted to pull her away from the crowd while others nearby began calling emergency services. legs. The two of them struggled. Around them, people were shifting and pulling back, which meant the ground underneath them was never still. Both of them lost their footing more than once as the crowd moved. Staff inside, aware of the growing pressure at the entrance, began unlocking the doors. The doors opened partway. The struggle carried forward with the movement of the crowd into the entrance corridor where a promotional display had been set up just inside. The force of multiple bodies pressing into the display at once shifted the frame off balance, partially dislodging one of the mounted television units from its bracket. As he tried to control her arms, she pulled away sharply, shifting her weight backward into the display frame. The back of her head struck the rigid edge, and she collapsed immediately. As she fell, one of the partially dislodged television units dropped from above and struck her. The people nearby stepped back. Multiple people had already begun calling emergency services. Staff came out from behind the counter. The line, which had been the entire point of the morning, stopped mattering. Responders arrived and began their assessment. Tasha Reynolds was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as fatal blunt force head trauma, with the primary impact against the edge of the display structure and a contributing secondary impact from the falling unit. She pepper sprayed a crowd, fought a police officer, and never even made it through the door. I have to be honest, when I first read this, I had to go back and check what was on sale that morning. Trust me, it wasn't worth it. It was May 26, 2018, in the Cherokee National Forest, where the morning light filtered through a dense canopy of hemlock and white oak, and the air smelled like damp earth and something older. Whatever happened that morning near the Benton McKay corridor happened quickly, and it happened because a series of decisions stacked on top of each other the way they always do before something goes permanently wrong. Tammy Mae Hargrove was 46 years old and had built a following online by positioning herself as a wilderness communicator, someone who believed the average person was too afraid of nature. Staff at 2 separate ranger districts knew her by name, not as a regular, but as a recurring problem. She had been cited twice for feeding black bears from her vehicle, and had argued both times that the animals were, in her words, misunderstood. She called them forest dogs. Rangers who encountered her described the same pattern: confident, dismissive, argumentative, and convinced she understood something that trained wildlife professionals did not. The trip had been framed around a joke. Sometime in early May, she had read about a black bear in the 1980s that had consumed a substantial quantity of cocaine dropped from a smuggling plane in a Georgia forest. Her friends later told investigators she thought a comedic reenactment using bacon, honey, and powdered sugar as stand-in contraband would make compelling content. Most of them assumed she was not serious. She had assembled a bait pack, tested camera angles in her driveway, and driven to a trailhead in a section of the forest with posted warnings about habituated bears and food scent management. She parked illegally on a service road and hiked roughly a quarter-mile in. She positioned the bait pack on a fallen log and moved approximately 15 feet back with a selfie stick and a helmet-mounted GoPro. She had handled the bacon and honey with bare hands. There was grease on her jacket sleeve and on the front of her shirt. The posted warnings she had passed on the trail included specific language about scent dispersion and the behavioral patterns of bears that had been conditioned to associate humans with food. She had not worn gloves. She had not suspended the bait. She had not told anyone where she was going. A ranger on routine patrol had noticed her SUV on the service road and radioed the plate before beginning a search on foot. He was moving parallel to the ridgeline when he heard movement in the brush below him and stopped. A large male black bear, later estimated at over 400 pounds by wildlife officials, was moving downwind of the log, its head low, tracking directly toward the bait pack. The ranger later told investigators he watched the bear reach the log and begin feeding. He was preparing to use his air horn when Tammy moved. She began backing away from the log while still trying to keep hold of her camera setup, then lost footing and shifted back toward the clearing edge as she reached for it. The bear's head came up. The distance between them was under 10 feet. She turned and ran toward a chestnut oak at the edge of the small clearing, grabbed the lowest branch, and her footing gave way on the wet root system at the base. She did not get off the ground. The bear covered the distance in under 2 seconds and brutally mauled her. The ranger ran toward the sounds and deployed the air horn in 3 sustained blasts. The bear disengaged and moved into the brush. He radioed for emergency medical response immediately. Rescue personnel reached the trail corridor in approximately 18 minutes. Tammy Hargrove was transported by ground unit and died from blood loss before reaching the receiving facility. The coroner's findings described severe lacerations to the neck and upper left shoulder, a crushed left forearm consistent with a defensive wound, significant blood loss from damage to major vessels in the neck region, and blunt trauma to the skull. Death was attributed to hemorrhagic shock. The bear was located and euthanized 3 days later. Local wildlife advocates were vocal in their objection, and they were not wrong. The animal had been conditioned over time by exactly the kind of behavior Tammy had been cited for twice before. The Park Service replaced the warning signage in that corridor with larger panels that include feeding incident history by year. My honest opinion is that the bear died for something it had been trained to do by people exactly like her. That part bothers me a lot, and I think it should. I'm aware of how quickly it would all go wrong. It was May 2019, Manchester, England, a public parking lot outside a retail complex on a busy Saturday afternoon. There were people moving through the area in both directions. It was the kind of place where small disputes happened and usually came to nothing. Donna Hale was 39. She worked as an administrative assistant and had a pattern of using physical confrontation to settle minor disagreements. She had slapped her ex-husband during an argument. She had done the same to a co-worker and to a family member on separate occasions. None of those incidents had resulted in serious consequences for her. Physical confrontation, in her experience, was something people backed down from. It had always ended there. That afternoon, she had been circling the lot for several minutes looking for a space. When one opened up near the entrance, she moved toward it and began reversing in. A man came from the opposite direction, pulled straight in from the front, and took it before she could complete the turn. He got out of his car, locked it, and walked toward the retail entrance without looking back. Donna got out and went after him. She caught up with him near the entrance and told him directly that she had been waiting for that space and that he had no right to take it. He did not respond. She told him he was not allowed to simply ignore her, that there were cameras in the lot and that she could report what he had done. He turned and tried to walk away. Donna positioned herself in front of him as if she had every right to stop him from leaving. He stopped, said nothing, and waited. Then he tried again. She blocked him a second time. A bystander nearby told her to leave it and let him go. Donna turned to the bystander and told him to mind his own business, that this had nothing to do with him. Then she turned back and kept going. What she did not know was that the man had recently been discharged from a psychiatric unit and was in the middle of adjusting his medication and treatment plan. He was not being passive out of weakness. He was actively working to stay disengaged. He had tried to remove himself from the situation more than once and had not been allowed to. He stood still, said nothing, and kept his reaction contained for as long as he could manage it. On his third attempt to pass her, she slapped him across the face. The slap was the trigger. Whatever regulation he had been maintaining collapsed in that moment. The response came immediately, and it was a single strike, but it landed with a force Donna had not anticipated and had no frame of reference for. She had done this before, and nothing serious had happened. This was not that. She went backward fast, and her head hit the pavement hard. She lost consciousness on impact and did not recover it at the scene. Witnesses moved in immediately. Someone called emergency services and others stayed with Donna until paramedics arrived. She was transported to hospital and admitted directly to intensive care. She was placed on a ventilator. A neurosurgeon performed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure that had built up inside her skull from the impact. The surgery bought time, but it did not change the outcome. Donna did not respond in the days that followed. She remained in a coma. Her family stayed with her. She did not regain consciousness. Donna Hale died from a traumatic brain injury caused by the fall. She was 39 years old. The man remained at the scene after the incident. He did not attempt to leave. He was taken into custody and later charged. Court proceedings included a full psychiatric evaluation. Medical evidence presented during the trial established that his capacity for self-regulation had been significantly compromised at the time of the incident as a direct result of his psychiatric condition and the disruption to his ongoing treatment. The jury accepted the evidence. The charge was reduced to manslaughter. He was not sentenced to a custodial term. A hospital order was imposed requiring him to remain under psychiatric supervision and continue treatment. It was June 18th, 2015, and the afternoon heat sat flat over the outskirts of Perm, Russia, where a municipal zoo had been quietly deteriorating for years. Maris Koval, 31, had not come to observe animals. She had come to film herself near them, and she would not leave the same way she arrived. Maris was Latvian-born micro-influencer and had spent several months living in Western Russia, steadily building a modest online following around what she called fearless living. Her content was consistent. Safety warnings dismissed. Restricted zones entered. She approached stray animals on city streets, walked through construction barriers, and narrated each act as evidence that fear was manufactured by institutions to control behavior. She had roughly 12,000 followers. She had no background in animal behavior, wildlife management, or anything adjacent to it. The zoo had been operating on a reduced municipal budget for over a decade. Concrete barriers along the big cat enclosures showed visible surface cracking. Warning signs had faded past the point of easy legibility. Fencing repairs were patchwork and inconsistent, leaving irregular gaps in sections of wire mesh. Maris began filming near the big cat enclosures, pointing her camera at the infrastructure and telling her audience the animals inside were misunderstood. She identified the gap between the outer barrier and the inner wire fence on camera and called it proof that posted warnings were theater. Several bystanders called out for her to stop. An older man moved toward a staff member near the path. Maris began a heated back and forth, gesturing aggressively, insisting that the zoo was overreacting, that the animals were harmless. She berated the man for wasting his time, challenged the staff member to prove her wrong, and ignored any attempts to reason with her. The conversation escalated as she leaned over the edge of the barrier, fingers pointed, voice rising, refusing to step back. She climbed over the outer barrier into the restricted buffer zone and moved to the inner wire fence. She crouched and extended her right arm through a wider section of the mesh. The tiger had been pacing the fence line for several minutes before this, likely due to the noise. The animal closed the distance in a single forward motion. Its jaws locked onto her forearm through the mesh, pressing the limb flat against the metal. The force of the initial impact drove her upper body into the fence. The tiger began moving its head side to side, a motion consistent with how large cats subdue and tear prey, applying simultaneous crushing pressure and lateral force. Blood reached the fence and the concrete behind her within seconds. Maris screamed once, sharply, and then her voice dropped off. The tiger did not reposition. It held the grip and continued the tearing motion, the mesh pressing into the wound site as the arm was worked against the barrier. Witnesses remained outside the buffer zone. No civilian intervention was possible given the arm's position through the fence. A zoo employee activated the emergency alarm, while another retrieved a high-pressure hose used for enclosure cleaning. Sustained water directed at the tiger's head and shoulders caused the animal to release and move several feet back into the enclosure. Maris collapsed against the fence. Staff contacted emergency services immediately, but blood loss was not controllable in the field. They could only pronounce her dead at the scene. The coroner identified the cause of death as traumatic hemorrhagic shock, resulting from severe crush and avulsion injuries to the right arm, compounded by blunt force chest trauma. No intact soft tissue structures remained in the affected limb. In the months following, local animal welfare organizations renewed calls for updated infrastructure at aging public facilities, not because the enclosure had failed, but because the buffer zone had been designed for people who observed its boundaries.
It was August 3rd, 2017. The afternoon sun beat down on a mid-tier hotel pool in Seminyak, Bali, where families splashed in the shallow end and tourists lounged under rented umbrellas. Diane Mitchell, a 48-year-old administrative manager from Perth, Australia, sat rigid in her deck chair, visibly irritated by the noise around her. Diane had earned a reputation back home for being difficult. Neighbors complained about her filing noise complaints against children playing in their yards. Her homeowners association record showed multiple disputes over minor infractions. Co-workers described her as controlling and quick to escalate disagreements into formal complaints. They said she approached life with a rigid sense of order, believing rules applied absolutely to everyone except herself, when inconvenient. This trip to Bali was supposed to be a reset after being forced into stress leave following workplace conflicts, but Diane's confrontational nature traveled with her. The hotel pool area was designed for family use, with designated quiet zones clearly marked away from the main swimming area. Diane had deliberately chosen a lounger in the active family section, despite staff suggesting the adults-only pool on the property's other side. She refused to move, insisting she had the right to sit where she pleased, and staff did not want to escalate the disagreement. She spent the morning glaring at children and muttering complaints to other guests, most of whom ignored her increasingly hostile demeanor. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, a 14-year-old Indonesian boy named Adi accidentally splashed water near Diane's chair while playing with friends. Diane exploded from her seat, screaming profanities at the teenager. Adi apologized immediately in broken English, but Diane continued her tirade, demanding he be removed from the pool area. Hotel staff began approaching to de-escalate the situation. Before staff could intervene, Diane spotted Addie's tablet device sitting poolside and grabbed it. Multiple witnesses watched in shock as she held it over the water, taunting the boy, before hurling it into the deep end. The expensive device sank immediately to the pool's 8-foot-deep bottom. Addie, panicked about losing his family's only tablet, dove after it without hesitation, despite being an inexperienced swimmer. Staff were momentarily distracted by other guests, and initial shouts were mistaken for horseplay, so no one reached the boy immediately. The boy struggled underwater, his movements visible through the clear water, as he grasped the tablet but couldn't push himself back up. His friends screamed for help. Diane stood at the pool, arms crossed. Addie's father, who had been inside the hotel, came running as the on-duty lifeguard and hotel security entered the water. The chaotic rescue attempt took nearly 45 seconds. Addie was pulled out after struggling underwater due to panic and the weight of the tablet, and CPR was initiated immediately while someone called emergency services. During the commotion, Addie's uncle, witnessing the entire incident and overcome with rage, shoved through the crowd and struck Diane once in the face with a closed fist. The punch sent Diane stumbling backward. Her feet slipped on the wet tiles and she fell hard, the back of her skull impacting the slick concrete pool, coping with a sickening crack. She collapsed onto the deck, blood from a scalp laceration immediately pooling beneath her head. Paramedics arrived following a call from the staff. Addie regained consciousness and survived. Diane did not. She was pronounced dead at a local hospital 90 minutes later. The coroner's report identified severe skull fractures at the base of her head, massive internal bleeding between her brain and skull, and fatal brain swelling. Death resulted from blunt force trauma to the head sustained in the fall. Addie's uncle was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. He received a suspended sentence. Diane's family settled civil claims filed by the hotel and Addie's family for property destruction and endangerment.
It was December 17, 2017 in Quezon City, Philippines. A small Christmas gathering was underway inside a mid-rise condominium unit, decorated with string lights, a compact artificial tree, and wrapped gifts clustered beneath it. The unit was warm and crowded, with movement flowing between the living room and a narrow hallway that led toward the building's interior stairwell. Holiday music played softly, and the mood was relaxed as the group prepared for a simple exchange gift. Marissa Delgado was 42 and had joined 3 close friends for the exchange. Although the gift rules had been agreed on well in advance, she had postponed shopping until the last minute and arrived with an unwrapped item in a plain bag. Inside the unit, she barely glanced at the decorations. Her focus went straight to the gifts beneath the tree, particularly a large box positioned near the front, which she immediately associated with higher value. The group settled into the living room and began the exchange gift. Names were drawn casually, and gifts were handed out one by one. When it was Marissa's turn, she received the smallest package. Inside was a purse bag, new, clean, and appropriate for the exchange. Others smiled, but Marissa's expression tightened. The size difference stood out to her. She glanced repeatedly at the larger gift beneath the tree, convinced it represented better value. As the exchange wrapped up, Marissa grew visibly agitated. She fixated on fairness, replaying the moment in her head. Instead of letting it go, she stood and moved into the hallway, signaling for one friend to follow. The narrow corridor led past the unit's entrance toward a concrete stairwell used as a secondary exit. The lighting there was dimmer, and the sound of the party faded behind them. The discussion escalated quickly. Marissa paced while gesturing, insisting the exchange had been uneven and that she had been shortchanged. She stepped backward as she spoke, focused on the argument rather than her footing. The stairwell door behind her had been left ajar earlier to allow airflow. There was no guardrail at the threshold, only a short landing before the steps dropped away. As she continued moving, her heel missed the top step. She lost balance and fell backward into the stairwell. Her body struck the concrete steps as she tumbled down a full flight, coming to rest on the landing below. The fall was witnessed immediately by the friend following her, who called out for help. The others rushed in and found Marissa motionless at the base of the stairs. Blood was visible around her head, and her breathing was irregular. Emergency services were called at once. Paramedics arrived within minutes and attempted resuscitation, but Marissa never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead at the scene due to severe head trauma and internal injuries sustained in the fall. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and torso. Toxicology testing showed no drugs and only minimal alcohol. Investigators found no defects in the stairwell or building structure. The death was ruled accidental, caused by a loss of balance during an argument. The party ended immediately. The remaining gifts stayed under the tree, unopened. It was July 17, 2015, at a small event hall in Charlotte, North Carolina. The room had been set up for a birthday celebration that was also carrying a second announcement, an engagement. The tables were decorated, the lights were low, and most of the guests were in a good mood when the night began. Vanessa Grant was 36 years old and was a guest. She had known the celebrant for years, close enough that she expected to be treated as someone who mattered in that room. When she arrived and found her seat, it was not at the main table. Others were being called forward, acknowledged in front of the room, included in ways that she was not. She noticed all of it. The engagement announcement had not been shared with her beforehand. She found out the same way the rest of the room did. To most people there, it was a happy moment. To Vanessa, it landed differently. I want to be clear about what she decided in that moment. She took an engagement announcement at someone else's birthday party as a personal attack. In a room celebrating something unrelated to her, she chose to make it about herself. She began making her feelings known. She approached guests near the center of the room and raised the issue of being overlooked, insisting it was deliberate and that she should not have been treated that way after everything she had put into the friendship. Her voice carried. The tone was not quiet. Some guests tried to redirect the conversation. Others stepped back. The attention in the room, which had just been warm and celebratory, began to shift. The cake table was positioned near the center of the hall. It was a folding table, the kind used at events because it is easy to set up and easy to move. The legs locked into place, but were not built to absorb lateral force. A layered cake sat on top, a tablecloth draped all the way to the floor, covering the frame underneath. Let me be real about this. The world doesn't revolve around her, but she just decided it should. Vanessa moved toward it. She placed both hands on the edge of the table and pushed forward and upward to flip it. But the table did not respond the way she expected. The weight of the cake was not centered. One set of folding legs gave way before the other. The table did not flip. It buckled, dropping sharply on one side while the other side lifted. Vanessa's forward momentum had already been committed. She had pushed forward with her full body weight, and the surface in front of her gave way too early to support it. The tablecloth shifted and tightened around her feet as the frame collapsed, catching at her lower legs just as her balance tipped forward. There was nothing stable left in front of her to brace against and no time to pull back. Her balance broke forward. She stumbled into the collapsing table and went down with it, her body continuing past the point where she could recover. As the table frame folded unevenly, one section of the metal support structure dropped, while another remained partially upright at an angle beneath the falling surface. With no opportunity to break her fall, she was carried forward into it. Her upper body struck first. The impact occurred against the exposed metal frame at a downward angle, with the force concentrated across a small, rigid edge at head level before her body continued to the floor. She fell into the collapsed table as it came apart beneath her. Emergency services were called. Guests moved back from the table. The room that had been celebrating an engagement minutes earlier went quiet. Vanessa Grant was pronounced dead following emergency assessment at the scene. A review of the incident determined that she had applied deliberate force to an unstable folding table, causing an asymmetric collapse of the support legs. With her movement restricted during the collapse, she was unable to recover and fell into the exposed metal frame, sustaining a fatal blunt force head injury. I still don't understand why the cake table became her enemy, but she turned a night meant for celebration into tragedy. It was December 12, 2018, on the Eastern Express Highway outside Mumbai at approximately 3 a.m. when a fog-bound construction corridor became the site of something investigators struggled to fully explain for much longer. Priya Nair was 24 years old and ran a small social media page. She had built a modest following staging public scares, always chasing bigger reactions, angrier confrontations, and the kind of clips that might finally push her viral. Local vendors near her neighborhood knew her differently. She was quick to shout over minor service disputes and filmed customer-facing workers when she felt wronged, often provoking arguments on purpose because those videos pulled more views, then posted the footage with commentary. Her newest project was a roadside costume scare, a towering figure constructed from PVC pipe, spray-painted metallic gray, rigged with mounted sirens, and a portable speaker system modeled on a popular internet horror concept, Siren Head. Apparently, friends said that she chose this because startled drivers and angry workers would make better content than anything she had posted before. A construction worker stationed at the site spoke with Priya before she entered the shoulder. He told her directly, more than once, that trucks running that stretch before dawn were overloaded, moving fast, and operating in near-zero visibility. She snapped back that he was ruining her shoot, lifted her phone to record him, and loudly accused him of harassing her for content. Then she walked onto the shoulder anyway. Priya placed herself approximately 4 feet from the active travel lane, near a cluster of barriers. She activated the siren system. Workers on site later said they heard it intermittently over equipment noise, a rising and falling electronic wail that, at that distance and in that visibility, was difficult to locate directionally. The cement truck came from the north. The driver, identified in traffic reports as Rajesh Patil, was operating a fully loaded commercial vehicle within the posted construction zone limit, approximately 25 miles per hour. But in those conditions, 25 miles per hour leaves well under a second of usable perception reaction time once a hazard enters the headlight bloom, after a hazard enters the sightline. He told investigators the first thing he registered was a tall, gray, reflective shape standing near the barriers. His initial read was construction signage, a marker or flag stand. Then it moved. I think about those fractions of a second of recognition and response more than anything else in this story. Patil applied the brakes immediately. The truck produced a rapid pulsing brake response, but the vehicle had no realistic distance to meaningfully decelerate before impact under those visibility conditions. The trailer shifted slightly under load as weight transferred forward, but not in a controlled or corrective manner. Workers nearby heard the brake application first, a hard, sustained mechanical hiss and vibration, before they understood what was happening. Then the impact. Workers described a single primary collision event followed by secondary movement along the shoulder surface, though their accounts varied under low visibility stress. No one at the site described it as loud. Several described it as wrong, a sound and a sequence that did not belong in the register of normal construction noise. Several workers reached the site within seconds and saw Priya on the asphalt, blood pooling. Emergency services were called immediately by the construction crew, who also moved manually to stop oncoming traffic. Priya was transported to a regional medical center and pronounced dead in the emergency room. The medical examiner's report documented massive blunt force trauma to the thoracic cavity and pelvis, consistent with primary vehicle contact, followed by secondary ground impact. Rajesh Patil was cleared following an initial traffic investigation conclusion, pending standard procedural review. Findings confirmed visibility below functional stopping distance and noted that the victim had positioned herself within the active travel corridor without pedestrian-grade reflective safety equipment. I've covered stories on this channel where someone did everything right and still didn't make it home. This is not one of those stories. What happened on that highway was not a miscalculation in the conventional sense. It was a decision made in fog, near fast-moving traffic in the dark, by someone who had stopped distinguishing between fearlessness and recklessness. It was August 14th, 2017, Birmingham, United Kingdom. A commercial car wash on a busy road on the south side of the city. You pull in, the machine takes over, and you sit still until it is done. That is how it works. conveyor track, high-pressure jets, brushes, and big industrial dryers bolted at the end of the bay, at the height of someone sitting inside a car. Claire Hargreaves was 42. She owned a boutique in Birmingham and had built it up over years into something she was proud of. She liked things done her way, the shop, the staff, the details. She did not like being told what to do by people she felt were below her level, and she did not hide that well. That morning she had run into a woman she used to know. The woman had married into money, and it showed. Nice car, nice clothes, easy manner. Claire left the coffee shop smiling and furious, and the mood stayed with her all day. She got to the car wash in the early afternoon. The attendant had been working there for 11 years. Before she pulled in, he told her what he told everyone. Windows all the way up. Sit still. Hands inside. Do not touch anything once the cycle starts. Claire nodded and pulled forward with her driver's side window still open. She knew it was open. It was not an accident. She had looked at it and decided it was fine. She ran a business. She had dealt with harder problems than a little water coming into her car. The gap was small. The man in the vest was not someone she needed to take seriously. It was going to be fine. The rinse started and a thin line of water came in through the gap and ran down the door. Claire looked at it and left the window where it was. Fine. The conveyor moved her forward, and the jets came on. The high-pressure jets were not fine. The spray hit the open window directly, and water came through hard and fast. It soaked the door, the seat next to her, the controls on the inside of the door. It was loud and cold and completely different from what she had told herself it would be. She reached for the window switch, but water was already running down her arm and across the panel. She hit the switch late and it did not respond the way she needed it to. The water kept coming. She decided that trying from inside was not working and pushed her head and shoulders out through the window opening, one arm against the outer door, trying to reach and adjust it from the outside as water kept pouring in. The conveyor kept moving. There was no way to stop it or slow it down from where she was. It moved the car forward at the same speed it had been moving the whole time. The dryers at the end of the bay were big metal units bolted to the frame. They did not move, and they had no way of knowing anything was wrong. They were set at the height of a person sitting inside a car, because that is all they were built to deal with. Claire's head and shoulders were outside the car when the conveyor pulled her into that section. The edge of the housing caught her across the head and forced her sideways. The car kept moving into the fixed structure, with her body caught between the outer door frame and the dryer unit. It did not stop until the automatic trigger at the end of the bay cut the conveyor. By the time the car came to rest, Claire was partially outside the vehicle and unresponsive. The attendant reached her within seconds. She was breathing but not responding to his voice. She said something fragmented that he could not make out. Emergency services were contacted immediately. She lost consciousness before paramedics arrived and did not regain it. Claire Hargreaves was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 42 years old. She died from severe head and upper body injuries from the collision with the dryer housing while her upper body was outside the car. The investigation did not take long. The window had been open against clear instructions. The machine had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Claire had pushed herself outside the vehicle while it was still moving through an active cycle, and the system had no way to know that or stop for it. After the incident, the facility added a window check to its entry process. No car would go in until a staff member had looked at every window and confirmed it was fully closed. It was March 4th, 2022. At a mid-sized leather processing facility on the industrial outskirts of Milan, Italy, a building where the air is chemically dense before you reach the door, and where the distance between a marked barrier and something irreversible is measured in inches. Chiara Benet was 35 and based in London, running a lifestyle content account built around organic products and what she called intentional living. Her following sat near 4,000. Her reputation among business owners was a documented pattern, arriving unannounced, filming without consent, threatening condemnation unless given free access or product. Based on her online footprint, she had likely identified this tannery through a supplier tag on a luxury brand's post and traveled to Milan for a stated content series on European manufacturing. She arrived without an appointment. The security gate held her. A staff member explained in Italian and broken English that entry required prior authorization and a signed liability waiver. She filmed the exchange and posted it before clearing the entrance. A junior employee without the authority to formally deny her eventually let her through to prevent the confrontation from worsening in view of the gate and against internal site protocol, requiring escorted visitor denial enforcement. Kiara had been on the processing floor under 8 minutes when a supervisor attempted to redirect her from the VAT-level walkway. She stepped around him and ducked under a safety chain at waist height. 2 workers followed her up the grating stairs, one calling for the floor supervisor by radio. She was still filming and narrating into her phone when her left foot landed on a section of grating saturated with chemical runoff and industrial wash water that had pooled unevenly across the mesh surface. The slip gave no warning. Her foot lost traction on the wet, residue-slick platform surface, and she stumbled forward in a sudden, uncontrolled step, her upper body pitching down as her core tried to compensate for the abrupt shift in balance. Her hands came up almost immediately in an instinctive reflex to stabilize herself, but the movement was slightly mistimed, and her fingers only brushed the railing without establishing a firm grip. Her forward momentum increased over the next fraction of a second as her trailing foot failed to recover under her center of mass, effectively removing any remaining base of support. She made brief, partial contact with the platform lip, not enough to arrest or redirect her motion, and that momentary impact only altered her trajectory slightly rather than stopping it. The railing, positioned above waist height, offered no effective catch point during the downward pitch. The fall developed as a single continuous movement, with no visible recovery attempt succeeding once her balance line had passed beyond the platform threshold. She fell in the vat. The 2 workers at the top of the stairs reached the railing within 2 seconds. One triggered the emergency stop alarm mounted to the railing post. The other ran to the shutdown panel at the base of the stairs. Neither entered the water. The surface agitated briefly from the initial disturbance and from the pressure shift caused by safety system activation beneath the platform. The mechanical circulation system ran approximately 4 more seconds before the shutdown reached floor-level components. Then, the surface settled into a flat, controlled stillness. The floor supervisor called emergency services at 11:14 a.m. A fire and hazmat team arrived at 11:51 a.m. Recovery required full chemical protective equipment and extended several hours into the afternoon. The coroner's report listed cause of death as chemical immersion fatality, consistent with acute exposure to industrial alkaline solution, causing severe chemical burns, rapid tissue destruction, and fatal systemic shock, with no medically supported conclusion of complete tissue dissolution or skeletal degradation in the immediate time frame described. Time of death was estimated at point of entry. The facility was suspended pending an occupational safety review. No criminal charges were filed against staff. 2 workers took extended leave. The junior employee who allowed her entry resigned within the week.
It was July 11th, 2018. The afternoon air along an active lava viewing area in Hawaii's lower Puna region carried the sharp smell of sulfur as molten lava moved through open channels. Carol Laxman, a 62-year-old retired real estate agent from Phoenix, Arizona, stood behind safety barriers with her expensive camera equipment, visibly frustrated that the cordoned area prevented her from getting closer shots of the active lava flow. Carol had built a modest following on social media, documenting her travels after selling her real estate business 2 years prior. Her online persona centered on capturing dramatic landscape photography, often featuring herself posed near natural wonders. Friends described her as stubborn and entitled, someone who believed rules applied to others, but not to her. She had traveled to Hawaii specifically to photograph the active volcanic flows, booking a guided tour with a commercial photography company that operated viewing platforms near the lava fields. Active lava flows present extreme hazards beyond the obvious molten rock. The ground surrounding flows consists of newly formed crust that can be dangerously thin, concealing underground lava tubes where superheated gases and molten rock flow beneath seemingly solid surfaces. Temperatures near active flows exceed 1,800 to 2,200 degrees, hot enough to ignite clothing and cause instant tissue damage. That afternoon, park rangers had posted multiple warning signs around the designated viewing area. Recent volcanic activity had created unstable ground conditions, and visitors were repeatedly instructed to remain behind safety barriers. Carol had already been warned twice by rangers after ducking under ropes to get closer shots. Other photographers in the area, including a professional crew filming for a documentary series, noticed her increasingly reckless behavior. Around 3:45 in the afternoon, Carol deliberately crossed the final safety barrier, climbing over warning signs that explicitly stated the danger of ground collapse. Several tourists shouted warnings as she approached the edge of an active lava flow. A park ranger stationed about 75 yards away began moving toward her position, calling out over a loudspeaker for her to return immediately. Carol waved dismissively and continued positioning herself on what appeared to be solid rock, overlooking a glowing lava channel. She was attempting to set up a timed photo with the flowing lava behind her. The thin crust beneath her feet gave no warning. She stepped onto a thin skylight, a fragile crust over an active lava tube, which collapsed beneath her, dropping her onto a superheated lava channel below. The documentary crew's cameras captured the moment of collapse. Witnesses heard her screaming for approximately 4 seconds before the sound stopped. The park ranger immediately radioed for emergency services, but the location and extreme temperatures made any rescue attempt impossible. A specialized volcanic response team arrived within 20 minutes, but could only establish a safety perimeter. 2 days later, after volcanic activity subsided, recovery teams located charred skeletal fragments at the flow's edge. The coroner's report confirmed death resulted from catastrophic thermal burns covering over 90% of her body, inhalation of superheated gases that destroyed her respiratory system, and thermal shock. The coroner determined she died within seconds from catastrophic thermal burns and inhalation of superheated gases. The documentary footage was turned over to authorities and never publicly released. Park officials temporarily closed the viewing area and installed additional barriers. Carol's social media accounts remained active for a few days, filled with comments from followers who never learned what happened during her final photo attempt, before being taken down at her family's request.
It was February 6, 2018 in Toledo, Ohio. Snow lined the sidewalks of a quiet residential block where a row of duplexes sat under dim streetlights. Inside one unit, the evening was uneventful. Maintenance requests were normally handled through a standard property system, with non-urgent issues scheduled days in advance. Nothing about the night suggested it would end in an emergency. Marcia Klein was 39 and worked in retail management. Co-workers described her as demanding and impatient, often escalating minor issues into confrontations. She expected immediate results and treated delays as personal slights. That same attitude had followed her home. Over several months, she had repeatedly clashed with property management, calling frequently and accusing staff of negligence over small inconveniences. That evening, a decorative glass lamp in her living room stopped working. It was not wired into the unit and had no connection to the building's electrical system. Property management explained that decorative items were the tenant's responsibility and did not qualify for emergency repair. Marcia reacted angrily, accusing staff of refusing to do their jobs and threatening to withhold rent. After several minutes of shouting, she ended the call and decided to fix the problem herself. Rather than replacing the lamp or waiting for a repair service, Marcia searched online and convinced herself the issue was a simple wiring fault. She believed professional repairs were unnecessary and intentionally overpriced. Ignoring manufacturer warnings printed on the lamp's base, she retrieved a screwdriver and extension cord from a storage closet. She placed the lamp on her kitchen counter near the stovetop and began dismantling its base. The wiring inside showed visible heat damage and fraying. Instead of disconnecting power, Marcia plugged the lamp into an outlet to test it while continuing to work. When the lamp failed to turn on, she repositioned it closer to the stove to improve visibility, inadvertently resting the cord against an active burner. Within minutes, the insulation on the cord began to melt. As Marcia leaned over the counter, the exposed wiring sparked, the cord ignited, and flames spread quickly up the plastic casing and into the lamp's base. Startled, Marcia attempted to pull the cord away, but the fire intensified, producing thick black smoke. The smoke filled the small kitchen rapidly. Instead of evacuating, Marcia attempted to smother the flames with a dish towel, which ignited immediately. Disoriented and coughing, she stumbled backward and collapsed near the kitchen doorway. The fire burned itself out shortly after consuming the cord and lamp base. A neighbor in the adjoining unit noticed the smell of smoke and called emergency services. Responders arrived to find Marcia unresponsive inside the smoke-filled apartment. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was smoke inhalation, with high levels of carbon monoxide and soot found in her lungs. Fire investigators ruled the incident accidental, caused by improper electrical handling and refusal to disconnect power during a repair attempt. Property management records documented repeated warnings about unauthorized repairs. The case was closed without charges. Investigators noted the death was preventable and directly linked to unsafe behavior during an unnecessary confrontation with a routine household issue. It was June 14, 2019, at a retail pharmacy in Scottsdale, Arizona. The afternoon queue was backed up past the greeting card aisle, and the two staff members on duty were working through prescriptions as fast as the verification process allowed. Danielle Brooks was 42 years old and was a real estate agent who had built her career on moving fast and making decisions without much patience for process. Earlier that week, she had taken amoxicillin for a minor infection and developed a rash and throat irritation within hours. She went to a clinic for evaluation, and the physician identified a suspected penicillin allergy based on her symptoms and advised strict avoidance of all penicillin-based medications going forward. Danielle questioned whether the doctor was being overly cautious and suggested the reaction had been exaggerated. She had not filled any follow-up prescriptions or obtained emergency medication after the clinic visit. I want to be fair, she was unwell, she was uncomfortable, but the decisions she made from that clinic visit forward removed every safety net she had. At home, her husband urged her to go to a pharmacy and get the correct prescription filled properly, but she refused. Over the next 2 days, her symptoms worsened enough that she finally drove to the pharmacy. She was not in a patient mood when she arrived. While waiting in line, she checked her watch more than once and let out quiet but noticeable sighs as the queue moved slower than she expected. By the time she reached the counter, her frustration had settled into something more pointed. She told the pharmacist she had been standing there far too long and wanted to know what exactly was causing the delay. As he began to explain the workload and the verification procedures required for each prescription, she cut him off before he could finish. When he tried again to clarify, she spoke over him a second time. She leaned slightly on the counter, her voice raised just enough for the people behind her to hear. She asked to see his credentials. When he remained calm and continued working through the queue in order, she interpreted the lack of reaction as indifference rather than professionalism. The pharmacist she was speaking over was, at that exact moment, the most important person in that building for her. He was the one who caught what happened next. During the exchange, he was in the middle of assisting another customer at the adjacent register. A completed prescription, already verified and bagged for that customer, had been set on the counter within the pickup area. As part of that transaction, while he confirmed a detail on the system, Danielle saw the bag and immediately assumed it was hers. The label was turned away from her, and although her name was not visible, the timing aligned with her expectation that her prescription should already have been ready. Acting on that assumption, she took the bag and stepped away from the counter, opening it as she walked. Without properly checking the label, she removed 2 of the pills and swallowed them with a sip from her water bottle, treating the moment as the conclusion of a delay she believed had already been resolved. And this is where everything took an unexpected turn. The pharmacist turned back just in time to see her with the open bag. He immediately told her the medication was not hers and that it contained a penicillin-based compound. He moved to clear space around her and instructed a colleague to call emergency services. Danielle initially dismissed the warning, stating that she felt fine and that the concern was excessive. As emergency services were being contacted, the pharmacist stayed with her, keeping her engaged and observing for changes. The first visible signs began to appear. She paused mid-sentence and touched her throat. Flushing spread across her face and neck. Her breathing became labored and uneven, noticeable from across the counter. As the symptoms progressed, her posture changed. She stopped arguing and lowered herself into a seated position without prompting. The pharmacist stayed beside her, continuing to monitor her condition and relay updates to the dispatcher while waiting for paramedics. By the time paramedics arrived, the reaction had advanced to a severe stage of anaphylaxis. Emergency treatment was initiated immediately, and she was transported to the hospital. Despite rapid intervention, the reaction continued to progress, and her condition deteriorated further after arrival due to the severity of the exposure. Danielle Brooks died later that evening. The cause of death was recorded as acute anaphylaxis, triggered by penicillin exposure, following ingestion of medication not prescribed to her. The pharmacist tried to stop her. I am not sure what it would have taken to get through to her at that point, but whatever it was, nobody in that building had it. It was September 30th, 2015, on the stone steps of a progressive congregation in Atlanta, Georgia, where the afternoon light was still warm, and the air carried the particular stillness that follows the end of a Sunday service, the kind of quiet that makes what came next feel harder to account for than it probably should. Margaret Derulo was 49 years old in a suburb north of Atlanta. She filmed confrontations with strangers on sidewalks, with businesses she disagreed with people she had decided on her own terms were morally deficient. She posted it on her Facebook. People in her orbit described her as someone who had once been deeply involved in her local faith community before that involvement narrowed into something harder to name. Her own son had cut contact after she broadcast details of his coming out as gay without his permission. She did not, by any account, slow down after that. She drove to that church alone. The couple she spotted, two women leaving the service holding hands, had no prior connection to her. They were simply walking out the front doors when Margaret began filming from across the courtyard and moved toward them. Several church members standing on the steps recognized what was happening immediately and asked her to stop. She didn't. The women tried to walk away. I want to be direct here. I understand that her convictions felt real and urgent to her. That still doesn't change what she chose to do next. Margaret followed them onto the top landing of the stone staircase, continuing to film and loudly accuse them of corrupting children within earshot of roughly 40 people. The landing at the top of the staircase was approximately 12 feet wide with a low stone railing on either side. The steps below were worn uneven with age. Several church members later told investigators they had already started moving toward the group when everything shifted. Margaret grabbed one of the women by the hair from behind. The motion was by multiple witnesses. The second woman reacted immediately, reaching out and pushing Margaret's forearm away from her partner's head. Every witness interviewed described the contact as a single defensive motion, not a strike. Margaret was still twisting to maintain her grip when her right foot found the edge of the top stair. She went backward, not quickly. Witnesses described it as almost slow, her body rotating slightly as her weight passed the point of recovery. Her left hand came up and caught nothing. One witness said the sound she made before she fell was not a scream, but something shorter, a cut-off gasp, less than a syllable. Several people on the lower steps moved out of the way reflexively. She struck the upper portion of the staircase rather than a clearly distinct third step, with the back of her head making the primary impact, then tumbled unevenly down approximately 3 to 4 stone steps in a single continuous motion rather than discrete step-by-step contacts before coming to rest against the stone half wall at the first landing. Several people started shouting at once. A church usher called emergency services immediately from the courtyard, while an off-duty nurse from the congregation reached Margaret within seconds and began monitoring her airway and pulse. Margaret was unconscious and unresponsive at the scene and was transported by ambulance to a regional medical center. She remained in a coma for 3 days. Attending physicians determined she had sustained a severe closed head injury with significant intracranial bleeding and diffuse traumatic brain injury with poor neurological prognosis. Her son, listed as next of kin, was notified. The decision to remove life support was made jointly by physicians and family. She died 3 days later. Police collected statements from more than a dozen witnesses over the following week. No charges were filed against either woman. I'll be honest, that finding was the right one, but I'm not sure it made things easier for the people who watched it happen in real time. Her son did not attend the funeral. A brief notice in a local paper listed him as a surviving family member without elaboration. I still can't get past the fact that the last years of her life were spent chasing confrontations with strangers, while the one person who had the most reason to grieve her decided not to be there. That's not a judgment. It's just what the record shows. It was June 18, 2017, Perth, Western Australia, a residential home in a quiet suburb. The kind of house that looked exactly the way an interior designer would want it to look. Clean lines, good furniture, everything considered. Melissa's husband was due back that evening for his birthday and the house was ready for it. Almost. Melissa Grant was 39. She worked as an interior designer and had spent years developing a sharp eye for how things should look, and an equally sharp opinion about people who did not meet her standard. She had a particular dislike for being charged a premium by someone she felt was overstating the difficulty of a job. when a sparking wall outlet showed up that morning. She called an electrician. He came out, looked at the outlet, and gave her the price. She looked at him and told him directly that she had been in the design industry for 15 years, had managed entire renovation projects, and was not going to pay that figure for a job that any person with a basic set of hands could complete in under half an hour. She told him she hoped his next client was less informed. He did not argue. He picked up his bag and left. She closed the door and went to find her phone. She watched 2 videos. The first one walked through the correct process. Turn off the breaker, test the circuit, confirm no live current before touching anything. It was clear and thorough, and it made the job look like it required more steps than she had time for. The second video was shorter. The person in it went straight to the faceplate, pulled it off, and worked quickly without any of the preliminary checks. That was the version she needed. She noticed the setup in the second video was not identical to hers, but decided that was a cosmetic difference and not something that changed the fundamentals. The extra steps in the first video felt unnecessary for what she saw as a simple job. She had just sent away a qualified electrician, so she chose the second video. She did not go to the breaker box. She turned off the wall switch and moved on. She had watched someone do this without isolating the breaker, and it had looked fine. She removed the faceplate and exposed the wiring. Everything looked manageable. She worked through the steps with confidence, handling the wiring the way the second video had shown. At some point, she registered that what she was looking at did not match the video. The layout was different in a way she could not immediately account for. She paused on it, then decided it did not matter enough to stop. Her husband was due home in a few hours. The wall switch she had turned off controlled the outlet's function. It did not isolate the circuit. The wiring behind the faceplate was live. When she made contact with the live conductor, the current passed through her. The current caused her muscles to lock and her hand did not pull back. The current kept moving through her and she had no way to break free of it. Her heart lost its rhythm and could not find it again. Her husband arrived home to find the house quiet and the lights on. He called out for her and got no answer. He found her on the floor near the outlet, the faceplate still removed and the wiring exposed beside her. She was not responsive. He called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived and worked on her at the scene, but she had been there for some time before he found her, and there was nothing that could be done. Melissa Grant was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was cardiac arrest caused by electrocution. The review confirmed the breaker had not been switched off at any point. The wall switch had been turned off, but that does not isolate the circuit, and the wiring had been live throughout. Investigators noted she had registered a visible inconsistency during the repair and continued anyway. The electrician she had turned away was contacted during the review. His quote had been standard for the work involved. It was November 22, 2018, and the evening rush at a suburban commuter station on Mumbai's Western Line had already packed the platform to capacity. Bodies pressed together, the air thick with diesel exhaust and the metallic groan of incoming carriages. Ria Dastan, 35, was from Pune who had relocated to Mumbai 8 months prior to expand her online presence. She was an urban social commentary influencer focused on video essays filmed in crowded public spaces, transit hubs, markets, government offices, where she narrated what she called institutional passivity and social dysfunction. Her videos circulated in niche urban commentary circles and had earned her a small but engaged following. She had built a reputation for engineering situations designed to provoke a reaction, then narrating over the footage with deliberate calm. According to witnesses and security cameras, she had scouted the station twice the prior week. Apparently, her plan was to descend onto the track, deliver her lines against the backdrop of an approaching train, and step clear before it arrived. She descended from the platform's southern end onto the active track bed, positioning herself just beside the nearest rail. Several commuters immediately called out from the platform. Instead of moving, she turned toward them and launched into a heated back and forth, berating the bystanders for wasting their time and challenging anyone to stop her. Her voice rose over the crowd, defiant and combative, dismissing any warnings. Mumbai's western suburban rail corridor is one of the densest commuter systems on the planet, moving upward of 7 million passengers daily on tracks that see intervals of under 3 minutes at peak hour. In Oncoming electric rakes approach station platforms at reduced but still significant speeds, typically between 25 and 35 miles per hour, with emergency braking distances that can extend beyond 300 feet depending on load and rail condition. The approaching train's horn had been sounding for several seconds before Rhea appeared to register it. Witnesses on the platform described the train entering the station with its brakes already engaged, the wheels producing a sustained metallic squeal audible over the ambient crowd noise. The motorman had spotted her from well outside the station and applied emergency braking immediately. Multiple commuters were shouting. Several were recording on their phones. A railway worker near the northern end had already begun running. Rhea was still arguing. The train was approximately 90 feet away and moving at an estimated 20 miles per hour. She moved laterally at the last moment, one sideways step, but her timing was off. The front left corner of the lead carriage struck her at the right shoulder and upper chest. The impact was audible from the far end of the platform. The force spun her counterclockwise. She did not fall clear. Her lower torso made contact with the leading bogie assembly as the train continued through its braking sequence. She was pulled under and dragged along the track bed for several meters. The train came to a full stop after traveling approximately 40 feet past the point of contact. A visible trail extended behind it. Blood, fabric fragments, and material from her bag distributed along the track surface and the concrete edge of the track bed. Her body came to rest partially beneath the stopped carriage. The platform had gone almost completely silent. Several commuters turned away. A man near the center of the crowd sank against the wall. The railway worker who had been running reached the platform edge and stopped. Station control was notified within seconds by platform staff, but it was too late. She was obviously deceased. The coroner's report noted catastrophic crush injuries to the right shoulder, thoracic cavity, and pelvic region, consistent with high-velocity lateral impact, followed by compression and drag trauma from a moving bogie assembly. The incident was logged briefly in internal transit authority records and appeared in a single regional news brief the following morning. Her name was not widely circulated. The track section was returned to service within 2 hours.
It was February 23rd, 2015. The Gold Coast beaches stretched under deceptively inviting skies, the kind of afternoon that drew families to the water, despite conditions that would prove deadly. Kylie Goldstein, 34, was about to make a series of decisions that would cost her everything. Kylie had lived on the Gold Coast for 8 years, moving from Brisbane after her divorce. Her 2 children, ages 7 and 9, often appeared hesitant around her, and neighbors had witnessed multiple public confrontations where Kylie berated them for minor infractions. She had accumulated 3 formal complaints from the local surf lifesaving club for previous incidents where she had argued with lifeguards. Swimming and beach activities formed Kylie's only reliable bonding time with her children, something she planned rigidly every weekend, regardless of conditions. She viewed beach safety warnings as suggestions rather than rules, evident from frequently telling other parents that lifeguards were overly cautious and that she knew the beaches well enough to make her own decisions. That afternoon, red flags lined the beach at a popular swimming area, warning of dangerous rip currents generated by offshore storm systems. Surf life-saving officers had announced beach closure over loudspeakers 3 times between 1 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon. Most families had already packed up and left. Kylie arrived with her children, immediately spotting the red flags. Her son pointed them out, asking if they should go home. According to the kids, Kylie told them they were swimming, or they would lose screen privileges for a month. At the water's edge, a lifeguard approached and explained the closure. Kylie interrupted repeatedly, demanding to know his qualifications and insisting the water looked fine from where she stood. The lifeguard radioed for backup, as Kylie raised her voice, attracting attention from the dozen remaining beachgoers. She lectured him about taxpayer rights and overregulation, while her children stood behind her, clearly uncomfortable. When the lifeguard turned to address another family, Kylie grabbed her children by their wrists and pulled them into the water. They waded to waist depth within 90 seconds. The rip current, invisible from shore but devastating in force, caught all 3 immediately. The beach's steep nearshore shelf meant waist depth came quickly as they stepped out, and the rip formed a strong seaward channel just beyond the breaker line. The children began screaming as the current dragged them seaward. Kylie, likely realizing the danger too late, panicked and tried swimming directly against the current, exhausting herself instantly. 4 lifeguards entered the water within 30 seconds of her submergence. One paddled a rescue board, while another secured a rescue tube, and an inflatable rescue boat was launched and stood by for recovery. Following protocol, They prioritized the children, who were closer and more manageable. 2 lifeguards reached the kids within 2 minutes, securing them on rescue boards. Kylie was now 200 feet offshore, flailing wildly and screaming incoherently. Her panicked movements accelerated her fatigue. 2 lifeguards swam toward her position, but a large set of waves pushed her under. She resurfaced briefly, arms thrashing, before disappearing beneath the surface. The crew called emergency services immediately when they lost sight of Kylie. Visibility in the churned water made her location impossible. A multi-agency search involving surf life-saving teams, water police, and helicopter units continued until nightfall and resumed at dawn. Kylie's body washed ashore 2 days later, discovered by early morning walkers 3 kilometers south. Prevailing currents and wind likely carried the body along shore. The incident was later reviewed through a coronial investigation, and updated safety signage was installed at the beach entrance following the findings. Her children received mandatory trauma counseling funded by Victim Services.
It was August 9th, 2021, at a riverside viewpoint along a slow-moving waterway outside Gainesville, Florida. The midday heat was sitting heavy over the bank, and the water below was dark and slightly opaque, the kind of tannin-stained surface that limits visibility below even a few inches down. Aisha Bello was 31 years old and had come to the viewpoint with a group of friends. She worked as a graphic designer and had a habit of framing everything through a camera lens, always looking for the best angle, always adjusting her position to get the shot she wanted. That afternoon, she was focused on photographing the river from the viewing platform. The platform had a fixed metal safety barrier running along the edge of a sloped bank that dropped sharply toward the waterline. The top rail sat around waist height. Signs posted along the barrier stated clearly that leaning over or crossing it was not permitted. The bank below was eroded and angled, meaning anyone who went past the railing had no stable ground beneath them. The rest of the group stayed back. Florida, alligator season. A safety barrier with signs on it, and she called it excessive. I genuinely do not know what was going through her mind. Aisha moved closer to the barrier and looked over the top rail at the water below. When one of her friends hesitated and pointed to the warning signs, she waved it off, saying the rules were excessive and didn't apply to something this simple. She leaned forward over the top rail to get the shot she wanted, glancing back briefly as if expecting someone to object, then continuing when no one stopped her. She extended her arm down past the barrier toward the surface, lowering her hand toward the water. She told her friends there was nothing there, insisting the warnings were overblown and that people always made things sound more dangerous than they actually were. It was literally just water. Her torso was angled forward well over the top rail, her upper body extended past it with her center of gravity already shifted beyond her base of support. When one of her friends said her name, she told them to relax and stop overreacting, adding that she knew what she was doing and wasn't going anywhere. I have read a lot of these cases, which you can check out later, but this is the first time I have seen someone argue with their friends about safety while danger was a second away. The water below the bank looked still. It was not empty. A large alligator had been resting at the waterline, partially submerged and motionless close to the bank's edge. When her hand dropped low enough into its range, the animal reacted with a short, explosive lateral surge from the edge. The contact with her extended arm applied sudden lateral force. At the exact moment, her center of gravity was already past the railing. With her weight forward and no stable footing on the sloped ground behind her, the force on her arm removed the last point of balance. She went forward over the top rail and down the eroded bank toward the water line in an uncontrolled fall. She reached the water's edge at the bottom of the bank. The alligator was already there. It clamped down on her arm and pulled her into the shallow edge water. The animal rolled, pulling her under and away from the bank. Her friends could see the surface of the water moving from above, but could not reach her. The movement stopped after a short time, and the surface settled. Aisha did not come back up. Her friends reacted immediately. Someone called 911 within seconds. Others moved toward the barrier. Emergency services were dispatched and arrived shortly after. Wildlife authorities were also contacted. Efforts were made to reach Aisha at the base of the bank, but the conditions at the waterline and the presence of the animal in the immediate area complicated the initial response. Aisha Bello was pronounced dead following emergency response efforts at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as fatal injuries sustained during an uncontrolled fall and wildlife encounter at the river's edge. Investigators confirmed that the safety barrier had been functioning as intended and was sufficient when used correctly. Every warning that existed in that moment was present and working. The sign, the barrier, her friends. She walked past all three. I do not know how many times a situation has to tell you no before it counts, and she paid the price. It was October 17, 2018, on a northbound underground carriage beneath central London during evening rush hour, when a sequence of small, deliberate decisions collapsed into something no one in that car could prepare for or undo. Fiona McIntosh was 38. She had spent 2 years building a following on short-form video platforms by filming what she called public etiquette violations: people eating on trains, commuters taking 2 seats, parents with loud children. She narrated her clips and posted them as civic accountability, but friends had privately said she was increasingly obsessed with views, sponsorships, and turning confrontation into something that might finally push her into real online fame. Transport staff had warned her at least once about filming strangers without consent, and she had followed a passenger off a bus to continue recording a dispute that started on board. She was not someone who backed down from these situations. That, in her framing, was the entire point. The carriage that evening was standing room. Owen John Delane, 25, stood near the doors holding his 14-month-old daughter, who had been cutting teeth for days. Multiple witnesses later described him as visibly exhausted, dark circles, an unpressed work shirt, one arm looped under the child, the other gripping a ceiling strap. He had been quietly apologizing to nearby passengers since he boarded. Apparently, Fiona noticed the child crying and began filming within seconds, narrating aloud for her phone about entitled parents and shared public space. An older woman nearby told her to leave them alone. Another passenger told her sharply to back off. Fiona moved closer instead, phone raised near the man's face. What she did next isn't a gray area, no matter how she framed the work she was doing. Owen asked her quietly to stop. What followed was captured on platform CCTV and confirmed by 6 passengers in subsequent statements. Fiona reached forward, pulled the pacifier free, and dropped it onto the platform through the open train doors below. The child screamed harder. Owen stepped toward the doorway to see where it had landed. One passenger near the doors moved as if to step between them, but the warning chime had already sounded and the doors were closing. Fiona leaned forward and shoved Owen hard in the shoulder, while he was bracing himself against the door frame and holding the child tight, shouting that he was coming at her. He barely moved. At that exact moment, the train began its departure, a standard forward lurch. Fiona was already leaning with her weight forward, one arm reaching for a vertical pole to her left. Witnesses said she missed it. I think that no one in that carriage wanted this outcome, including people who had watched her the entire time and said nothing. She went sideways. One of her feet slipped into the platform gap as the carriage pulled forward, and the motion twisted her hard off balance. The gap between the carriage and the platform edge narrows to roughly 10 inches as a train pulls away. Witnesses described her lower body catching first, her torso turning sharply as she was pinned against the platform edge and dragged down out of sight. Several passengers screamed. Owen reached toward her on instinct and caught only the sleeve of her coat before it slipped free. A passenger near the opposite doors pulled the emergency alarm immediately. The driver received the alert and initiated an emergency stop, but the train had already traveled several feet past the point of her fall. 2 witnesses near the doors turned away from the gap almost immediately. Paramedics and transit police arrived in approximately 6 minutes. Fiona was found trapped in the gap between the train and the platform edge, visibly deceased. The coroner determined she had sustained fatal crush injuries. Owen gave a full statement and was not charged. Platform CCTV footage and 6 independent witness accounts confirmed the sequence without material contradiction. Service on the line was suspended for just over an hour. There are details from this that I haven't been able to set aside. The child at the center of all of it was 14 months old and had no stake in anything that happened.